Thank you very much. Well, it gives me great pleasure and it is an honor to introduce Mr. C.F. Martin IV. Chris Martin.
Good evening. What a treat to be here. Carmen, who could not be here, is our European sales rep from Nazareth. And he said, "You're not going to believe this store." I can't believe how many guitars fit in this store. Remarkable. Can I tell you a little bit about my family's business?
Yes.
Okay. How much time do we have? My great-great-great-grandfather grew up in a small town called Marknerkirchen, which is, picture in your head, okay, here's Munich and here's Prague. Marknerkirchen is kind of in between. Marknerkirchen was known then, and really up until shortly after the wall came down, it was part of the East, as one of a few towns in that part of Lower Saxony where they made very nice musical instruments, including really good copies of Italian bowed instruments. So in fact, if you go to a jumble sale and look at this violin, and you see it's a Stradivarius, nah. It was made in Marknerkirchen as a copy. The guitar, maybe not so much then. Where's the acoustic guitars? Okay, the acoustic guitar the guitar that we know, that we're comfortable with, is a relatively modern invention. But things that historians say begat the guitar go back to Mesopotamia. They really believe that there were instruments that had a resonant body, a neck with frets, and strings. So that's how far back that thing that, you sort of kind of say, yeah, that was the beginning of the guitar. It went through a lot of iterations, the vihuela, the lute. By the late 1700s, early 1800s, it was pretty much something we would recognize. Oh yeah, I know that's a guitar. For whatever reason, we don't know. There's no diaries. We've got meticulous records, but no diaries. So what we do know is that CF, as a young man, became very curious about the guitar. He worked with his father as a young man making furniture. So he learned how to manipulate wood. But he became curious about the guitar. The guitar was working its way into Northern Europe. And he said, "Pop, good news, bad news. I want to learn how to make guitars, and I don't want to join the family furniture making business." And God bless his father. His father said, "Fine, follow your bliss. If that's what you want to do, have at it. But I don't know how to teach you how to make guitars. Ask the violin makers in town, in Marknerkirchen, if they will teach you." So we went around town and they're like, "Oh, you went through this long, arduous apprenticeship. You follow in your father's footstep. He has a good reputation making benches and chairs and tables and furniture and sideboards. No, I want to make guitars." Oh, young CF, it's a fad. It's a lowly folk instrument. It's not a classic instrument like the violin. Don't bother. Well, his father said, "All right, we've got to find a way to help you follow your dream." And he got him a job in Vienna, working for a fellow named Johann Stauffer. And you may have seen pictures of old Martins, the original. You've seen them, right? The only remaining design feature of the Stauffer headstock, and I am convinced of this, is that Leo Fender was inspired, right, by the Stauffer headstock. So he moved to Vienna when he was 15 years old by himself. And he worked there for several years, learned how to make Stauffer-style guitars, befriended an older co-worker. They formed a partnership, broke away from Stauffer. He married that co-worker's daughter, had a son, dissolved the partnership, came back home. "I'm going back to Germany. Now I know what I'm doing. I want to go back where I grew up, and I'm going to hang out my shingle, C.F. Martin guitar maker." So he comes back to Marknerkirchen, and while he was away, the violin makers had gotten into the guitar business. Yeah. And they weren't happy. CF rolls back into town. He's like, "Oh, I'm going to open a shop." And they go, "No, not so fast. This is still the law today in Germany. If you want to practice a trade or a craft in Germany, you must, by law, apprentice." And they said, "Mr. Martin, you have to apprentice." He said, "No, I'm in a hurry here. I don't want to apprentice because you guys wouldn't teach me." They said, "Well, now we can teach you because we're making guitars. You have to start at the beginning." Still the law today in Germany. want to practice a trade or a craft, you must go through this long, it's a kind of a good idea, although I read recently, they said it's taking a little too long. With the fast-paced world that we live in, we might want to shorten up this apprenticeship program. We do know that he had some acquaintances who had emigrated to the New World, and they were corresponding with him saying, hey, come to the New World. And so in the fall of 1833, he packed up his family, which now is his wife, a son, and a daughter, his worldly possessions, and we think some finished guitars. Got on a schooner in Bremen, sailed across the Atlantic, and opened up a shop at 196 Hudson Street. If you go to Manhattan on vacation, go down, it's pretty far downtown. It's on the upper side of the financial district, because that's where New York was. It's a block-long office building, but there's a bronze plaque on the side of the building that says, in this block was the location of the first workshop of C.F. Martin guitar building. Business was good. The advantage the acoustic guitar has is it's often been called an orchestra in a box. So you don't really need other instruments. That works great with other instruments, but you don't need them. And it was portable, so you could take it with you. The majority of the immigrants were not staying in New York. That was just a jumping off point, or Philadelphia, or Baltimore, or Boston, and we're going somewhere else to find opportunity somewhere, maybe all the way to Ohio back then. And you could always stick the guitar in your Conestoga wagon as you hitched your horses up and headed west. Mrs. Martin was not happy. And so in 1839, they moved to Nazareth, where we have been located ever since. Along the way, two things happened, and I've given this talk. I'm 62. I started doing this when I was about 21. So I've gone around the world and all across America telling this story. And a couple of years ago, a gentleman came to visit, and he said, Chris and Dick Boak, I want to write a book. Good, we love that. What's the book going to be about? Well, we want to try and answer the question. So you've seen the Stafford guitar, right? The question was, why on earth did he stop making those and start making these? Good question. I never thought about that. And along the way, they also came to discuss the X-brace, which is an integral part of how a Martin guitar is made and kind of holds it together and makes it sound good. So we said, what do you need? We need access to your entire collection and your archives. Great. So they went into our museum, they laid out a table, put out all these guitars that were ours and theirs, and they're looking at the archives, and they wrote a book about that question that they tried to answer. And there was an exhibit at the Metropolitan Museum of Art after the book was published. So I got to read the book, thank goodness, and I went to the exhibit half a dozen times. So how did this happen? That he stopped making the Stauffer guitar and started to make, at that time, a slot head, wide fingerboard 12-fret guitar, and they concluded that even then, customers, when they pictured a guitar in their mind, it looked like a Spanish classic guitar. So if this had nylon strings, you might think it's a classic guitar. But that's what, when people thought of the guitar, that's what they pictured, because that's what they were used to seeing, and it was hard lifting to sell that Fender headstock Martin with a funny bridge. And so in the book and at the exhibit, they had some Spanish classic guitars from the 1840s, 1850s. And I looked at them, I said, they're okay. And in the book, they said they were made in Cadiz, which is right down on the Mediterranean, hot and humid. And as much as the Spanish builders wanted to export their product, it didn't travel well. And so when they came to America, they fell apart. And CF said, wait a minute. I'm trying to convince people to buy this quirky looking thing. Meanwhile, they want to buy that thing and they're falling apart. So he said, I can build a better mousetrap. And he did, and we have some in our collection. He was a good woodworker, and he knew how to make guitars, and he made them in the climate in which they would live. And that solidified his reputation as someone who made something that was never cheap, but it was good value. It held together. And if you come to visit, which you need to, and you take the tour and you spend some time in the museum, when you get to the second display case, you're going to go, that's what Chris was talking about. There's that guitar that looks like it was made in Spain. So he copied them. It happened. They can work. The other thing that came out of it was very traditional Spanish guitars. You tie the strings on the bridge. But sometimes he made what's called a pin bridge guitar. Spanish builders put a brace down here, and then they used these little, what they're called fan braces. And the scholars said it's quite possible that he got frustrated because when he went to go drill the holes in the top, he drilled through the braces. So he began to move the braces out of the way, and ultimately came up with what we call Martin X bracing, just sort of as a practical matter. And it turned out to work remarkably well when we transitioned to steel strings, which I'll get to in a minute. CF Jr. joins the family business. Business is growing. The son's like, yeah, I'm going to join the family business. And he followed in his father's footsteps. And this is often the case in a family business. I read a lot about family businesses because, so I go to family business conferences. And I am known, first of all, I'm a rare duck, because I'll be at this family business conference. And they'll go, who's Gen 1? Everyone in the room raises their hand. Who's Gen 2? The majority of the people raise their hand. Who's Gen 3? It's getting they get to Gen 6 and everyone's looking at me like, whoa, what's going on? But so I study, I'm curious, fascinated about, how do you run a family business? It's not easy. Maybe some of you have been in family businesses. You can't take it for granted. But oftentimes, the second generation follows in the founder's footsteps. Hey, mom or dad had a good recipe, it seems to work, not messing with it. So CF Jr. followed, said dad has a good thing going, just going to carry on. Hopefully we can make more if the band picks up, which it did. There was a tremendous amount of upheaval, economic upheaval in America in the 1800s, and the Civil War. Americans were killing Americans 50 miles from the factory. The interesting thing about the guitar, particularly, again, the acoustic guitar, is it's often, the demand for them doesn't necessarily fall off a cliff during a war. And there, for example, in the Civil War, and this is recorded, not like recorded on tape, but in a book, that, during the day, fighting, shooting, whatever. But in the evening, everyone goes kind of retreat back to camp. Cook some dinner, roll out your bedding, light a fire, and guess what? Play the guitar. To just kind of bring some sanity back to the insanity of war. And that's been the case more often than not during the war. In fact, our oldest international distributor relationship is with Tom Lee Music in Hong Kong. The oldest relationship we have. And back in the 60s, they contacted us and said, is it possible for us to get the Martin dealership for Hong Kong? And I remember I was talking to my grandfather about it. He said, we contacted them back and said, the Chinese like American guitars? They said, no. They don't know what American guitars are. Well, why do you want the distributorship? Well, because we're seeing these soldiers come out of the jungle in Vietnam. They got a weekend of R&R, and they've got money in their pocket. And they want a D-28 to take back into the jungle to recreate with. And we need D-28s. Our oldest relationship goes back to that Vietnam War era when Tom Lee Music supplied the soldiers with something that kept them sane. Okay, so it's the third generation now. We're toward the middle to the end of the 1800s. Frank Henry, don't ask me why he wasn't CF, I don't know. Frank Henry Martin becomes the operator. And he recognizes that the mandolin is becoming quite popular in America. Starts out with that bowl back. You ever see those? They call the tater bug. They were from Italy. The Italians brought them to America. Kind of an odd thing. Imagine trying to play something with a round back. I think it was the inspiration for the Ovation guitar, but I could be wrong. So he goes to New York to see Mr. Zobish, who was our master distributor, who was much older. And he said, Mr. Zobish, I'm going to get into the mandolin business. He goes, no, you're not. Why not? Because I have my own proprietary line of mandolins. So they had a row, and they dissolved the partnership. And there's a very significant break point from 1895 to 1896 when they had this big argument. We stopped stamping the guitars in New York, which we probably shouldn't have been doing. We started to put serial numbers on them, and we took control of distribution, which we still control today. And that's why I'm here. We have a relationship with Westside, and Westside works with Guitar Village, and it all seems to work out. And Craig and I come around and just kind of, not to check up on anybody. Where's Johnny and Phil? Yeah, we're not checking up on you. Just we're trying to help you here, buddy. We're not checking up on you. And we had a good run with mandolins up until the Great Depression. More significantly for me, because we still make them, is the ukulele, which has a bit of a resurgence today in America. So the ukulele ended up in Hawaii, or it came from Hawaii. Do you know why? Do you have any idea? Well, 100 years ago, we got in the ukulele business, so I've become the in-house ukulele expert. And if we had time, I could spend 45 minutes talking about the ukulele, but I'll give you the brief synopsis. Entrepreneurs recognized that the sugar cane would grow prolifically in the Hawaiian Islands, but it's very labor intensive. And so they went, because the economy was bad, they went to Portugal and they put up posters. Good work, excellent pay, wonderful climate, bit of a commute. And apparently I read a book about it, and they said the economy in Portugal was so bad that young men were like, any kind of job, anywhere, and they were used to being on a ship, so they didn't mind getting on a schooner, sailing underneath South America and shooting 4,500 miles up into the Pacific to go to the Hawaiian Islands to harvest cane for good money. And they brought with them this little indigenous Portuguese folk instrument that became the ukulele. And then the Hawaiian Islands became a territory of the US, and people began to go visit there. It was, so exotic. But it was kind of America. They needed a passport, they took US dollars, the rule of law applied. And so my great-grandfather made some prototype ukuleles, sent them to a store in Honolulu that he sold guitars to, and the store took a look at them, passed them around the shop. Everyone's like, put them back in a box with a note. Mr. Martin, you make great guitars. Stick with guitars, you don't know how to ukulele. We got busy. There was an exhibit in San Francisco called the Pan-Pacific Exposition, and they featured Hawaiian music, Hawaiian food, and people went crazy. Americans went crazy for Hawaiian music. It swept across the nation. We said, we really got to get into the uke business. We bought a Nunez. Mr. Nunez was an Italian builder that had emigrated to Hawaii, a good woodworker. He saw demand, and he made a very fine Hawaiian-style uke. We bought one, and we copied him. We made it right, and off to the races. We put an addition on the factory just to make ukuleles. That's how popular the ukulele was. Okay, where are we? All right, so let's say 1920s, right? So George Gruen, anybody ever hear of George Gruen? He's a vintage guitar dealer. Not that you should ever buy from George, because you have a wonderful vintage guitar dealer and new guitar dealer here. But George, really knowledgeable, and he's a good author, and he writes articles and books, and he can talk and talk and talk and talk. So I said, George, one night we're having dinner, he and I'm like, I got nowhere to go. Why did my family stop using gut strings and start using steel strings on the guitars in the 1920s? And he said, Segovia. And I thought, Segovia? Not sure about that. Not sure I've ever heard you answer a question in one word. And I'm not sure what you mean by that, because I had met Segovia. When I was very young, my grandfather took me to a Segovia concert. He was a maestro. And I went backstage, I got to meet him. I thought, I don't know about this. He told me his theory. I thought, that kind of makes sense. I came home and I Googled Segovia. And sure enough, in the 1920s, young Andre Segovia, virtuoso classic guitar player, came to America, and to wide acclaim. And people were like, oh my God, I want to do that. How could I do that? And so he said, you must practice, and you must buy a fine Spanish guitar. So the guitars that were not well made in the 1840s, they were much, much, much better by the 1920s. The builders had emigrated to Madrid, the climate was more temperate, and they were hell-bent on exporting their product, and their product was more durable. And that endorsement moved the market away from us. The company just, what are we going to do? Fortunately, we recognized that if those metal strings worked on a banjo and a mandolin, maybe they'll work on a guitar. But they were still 12-fret, slot-head, small-bodied guitars. In 1929, a famous vaudeville banjo player came to visit us and said, I want to give up the banjo because vaudeville's going away. I'm going to take up the guitar. And guitar builders, this is funny, I read an article in Vintage Guitar magazine about the tenor guitar. I was like, how did that thing come into existence? The tenor guitar was created by guitar builders who were trying to convince banjo players to play the guitar. So we said, Perry, tenor guitar. He said, no, I want 6 strings, 15 fret neck. Not gonna work. So he left, what can we do? We took the neck from an archtop guitar, which was already narrow and 14 frets with a solid head, and put it on a guitar where we bent the sides over. In fact, a guitar just like this, and he liked it. We thought, okay, we're on to something. And then the Depression happened, and business was just abysmal. It was terrible. And so 2 years ago was the 100th anniversary of the Martin Dreadnought guitar. Ever hear of the Dreadnought? The HMS Dreadnought?
Yes.
Okay. So I've done a little research.
Okay.
So I didn't really know much about the Dreadnought. I didn't grow up in my family's business. I became interested when I was a teenager. And then I'm like, okay, I got a lot of catching up to do. So I lived with my grandfather, and I was working like summers in the, in the shop or whatever. In fact, I did a rotation in the shop. I helped to build a guitar in between high school and college. And I learned 2 really important lessons from that. That my colleagues who build guitars every day are really good at it. And unlike Bob Taylor, and you can quote me on this, Chris Martin is dangerous with a chisel. But I said, Pop, yeah, what? We're watching basketball. I love basketball. We had dinner, and I said, Pop, the Dreadnought guitar, where did that name come from? And he said, oh, my father was a history buff. And he named it after a British battleship. Okay? So 2 years ago, in the run-up to the anniversary of the Dreadnought, I thought maybe I should do some more research. And in fact, if you come to visit, which you must, when you get to that section in the museum, we actually have a scale model of the HMS Dreadnought, because I became really fascinated by the story of Jackie Fisher going to Parliament saying we've got to upgrade our fleet. I mean, the British ruled the seas, right? The sun never set on the British Empire, and he said, look, if we don't pay attention here, this could go sideways. So Parliament's like, what do you need? I need money and naval architects, and we've got to get a prototype in the water soon, quickly. So they build this thing, and it goes on a world tour. Everyone's like, oh my God, it's a game changer. And the most significant thing was it was the first what was called the all big gun ship. Because prior to that, battleships had short range weapons, medium range, long range. And they said, no. We have a turbine engine, we're fast, we can back off and just pummel them. So they put all these big guns and turrets. So why am I telling you this? Because I thought, okay, there must have been a reason beyond, I'm a history buff. So the more I studied the Dreadnought, and then of course the Super Dreadnought class and World War I didn't know much about World War I until I started to read about the Dreadnought. And boy, oh boy, what a challenge, right? You were not willing, and your allies on the continent were not willing to just roll over when the Germans, and what I read was the Germans came to the British and said, this must be hard work, all this controlling all of the seas at one time. We're just here to help you. Why don't we split the difference, right? And the British are like, I don't know about that. And so you build the prototype, and everyone decides to upgrade their fleets to copy your Dreadnought, and World War I happens, which was mostly a land war. And one of the reasons it was a land war is because the Dreadnought ultimately just kept the Germans bottled up. And there's a long history of if you're obsessed like I was, and I honestly I could talk about this for 45 minutes. And I've spent several nights recently doing that, and I just can't do it again. But I'll come back sometime if you ever want to hear my version. But what I took away from it was, in reading about how here we are as America going, of course we're your allies, and we're rooting for you. we want you to win. And apparently at some point, we realized we can't just sit idly by 3,000 miles away and root for you. We had to come and help. And that was the point, I think, at which my grandfather said, there's a reason that this big guitar should be called a dreadnought, because of the relationship that we have with you. And I think he named that guitar a dreadnought as a compliment to that relationship we have with the British Isles in America. And what I like about it, when you dissect the name, I mean, in some respects, he was a marketing genius. You know, if someone had someone would pay good money to a marketeer to go, you need to call that the Fear Nothing. And he did it for free because he was a history buff. And so our biggest guitar fears nothing. And that gives me inspiration, because every now and then a new competitor pops up. And I'm like, nope, we're okay. We're the real thing. Okay, so we're making steel string guitars. We've got the 14 fret neck. We've got the dreadnought. The original dreadnought was 12 fret. And it didn't sell well. It did not sell well. People were like, this thing's too big, it's hockey, it's bass heavy. And then Gene Autry contacted my grandfather through a dealer and said, Mr. Martin, I want one of those dreadnoughts. Great. I want a fancy one. Okay. I want a Style 45. He bought the first Style 45 dreadnought and played it in his movies. And it didn't just influence people who saw the movies, it influenced his fellow singing cowboys, who were pretty darn good, pretty much country musicians. Gene, what do you got there? Got a Martin dreadnought. I got to get one of those. And that caused particularly country players to go, man, there's something here. This thing has a sound that projects in a big room. And you know, honestly, it was not an overnight sensation. It took a good 10 or 15 years for it to kind of become the thing that it is today. World War II comes along. All of these soldiers go off to fight yet again, another war that we both had to participate in. We hired women to build guitars, didn't miss a beat. We stopped scalping the braces just because it was just too much work and nobody cared. And the herringbone trim that you find in the HD28, we ran out of it. And we figured we probably, even if we placed another order, it wouldn't get filled because it was made in Germany. And we didn't start making the herringbone D28 again until 1976. War is over, soldiers come home, business picks up, and then country music becomes more popular. Bluegrass as an offshoot of country, and then folk music. My dad joined the family business in 1955. The year I was born, I guess he needed a job because he had to take care of the kid, and he caught the folk boom. Holy mackerel, oh my gosh, off to the races. A little bit here in Great Britain, you had skiffle with Lonnie Donegan, and in the US we had, you know, the early folkies, and then all of a sudden like the Kingston Trio, they were pop stars, and they played Martins, and we've been so blessed for generations that we don't make the gaudiest guitars, we don't make the fanciest guitars, but they work. And musicians tend to gravitate to them. And so when people went to see the Kingston Trio, they would then they'd go on Saturday, on Monday, they go to the music store, what was that guitar that Bob Shane played? He plays a D28. I gotta get one of them, I'm gonna play that Kingston Trio music. Business was so good that the factory we were in, the old factory, which you can still see and visit if you come, when you come to visit, not if. So we built the new factory, and that's where I work today. It's a little bigger than it was back then. And we started to catch up to the folk boom and folk music and rock and roll collide. Holy mackerel. Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, Peter, Paul and Mary, Simon and Garfunkel, Judy Collins, Joan Baez. Unbelievable. And now I'm getting interested in the business. So I'd be like 12 or 13. And it was a couple of years later, I remember saying to my dad was he wasn't a beatnik, but he kind of looked like one. He had a Van Dyke beard, and he liked folk music, and his drugs of choice were tobacco and beer. And I remember saying, Dad, we didn't have a great relationship. But I remember one time, just because I caught the tail end of the hippie era. And I said, Dad, what do you think about those hippies? Pot smoking. Pot smoking, draft dodging. And I said, what do you think about them? He said, you know what? They're buying Martin guitars and they're making good music. I'm okay with it. I thought it was pretty cool. Yeah. So we expand the business, he made a brilliant move. He bought a string making company called Darko from the D'Adarios. Brilliant move. Ultimately, John D'Addario Sr. and my dad didn't get along, so they split. And so about a year after John D'Addario and his son split away from our business, someone came to my dad and said, Frank, the D'Addarios are getting back into the string business. Don't you have a non-compete? Part of the deal when they split was they signed a document saying, we will not compete with Martin in making strings for 5 years. So about a year later, they're starting to make strings, and they go, Frank, what about the non-compete? He said, don't worry about it. Nothing will come of it. Oh well. We're good friends today. We're competitors, but I'm good friends with the next two generations of the area. So he bought a drum company, a guitar factory in Sweden, 11 guitars, if you ever heard of them, and a banjo company. Great. This company's getting big. It's gonna be big, big, big. And then, and if you have any interest in folk rock music, there's a really good book called The Canyon of Dreams, and it's about the folk rock scene in LA, because that's where a lot of them went, because that's where the record companies were. And it's about the scene up in Laurel Canyon in particular. That's where, Crosby, Stills and Nash hung out. Mama Cass actually introduced Graham Nash to Stephen Stills and David Crosby up there. The Doors were up there, and Frank Zappa. Fascinating book. I savored that book all summer long. And then towards the end of the book, they're talking about the Eagles. The book is over. That was it. That was that era. And music, as it often does, it changed. And people's interest in guitars waned, thanks to the Yamaha DX7, which was not the first, but probably the most robust and affordable digital sampling keyboard. And if you come to visit, and I get a chance to give you a tour of the museum, we will get to the end of that display, the folk rock era, and there will be leaning up on the side of the case a Yamaha DX7. And while I'm talking to you, I will subtly go over and flick a switch, and as I talk, a disco ball will come down from the ceiling of the museum, and a light will shine on it. And so that's what happened. And it just happens that people get tired of some kind of music. It was tough. It was tough for even electric guitars. It was a tough time. So I'm going to fast forward. So 3 of the 4 acquisitions weren't working. My dad had a great solution. He retired. Now I'm coming out of college and I'm going, I went to college to study family business and running a business, and the business looks pretty precarious here. I'm not sure. My grandfather reasserted himself, God bless him, and then he passed away. And that really sent a shockwave through the company. Oh my gosh, the patriarch has passed, the son is in Florida playing golf, and there's this kid kind of floating around the office that we don't really know because he didn't grow up here. And then the board took a chance on me. I'm like, okay, I guess. I was never a born leader. I went on Outward Bound. And I'm so appreciative. I don't know if you know about Outward Bound, but my understanding is that during maybe World War II, that merchant ships were being sunk. And what they found was that the grizzled old salts, the old sailors on the merchant ships, they would find them in a life raft. They were fine. The young people died. So someone said, we got to teach these young people some life skills. And out of that grew Outward Bound. So I went myself. I can't begin to tell you how inspirational that was for me personally. I've taken over 600 of my coworkers on Outward Bound trips. So if you ever run into anyone who's participated in Outward Bound, thank them, because it came from Great Britain, and it's invaluable for me personally. And I thought, okay, I guess I'm in charge. And there's stories about, those Martins from the 70s, they're okay. And I thought, well, that's not good. They shouldn't just be okay. They should be the best guitarists in the world. So I said to my colleagues, look, we got to pick up our game here. And we had gone from 23,000 to 3,000 guitars. I don't care how many we're making, they've got to be good guitars. And that kind of resonated with everyone. Okay, Chris wants to make better guitars. All right, now we're going to fast forward. So a couple years later, I went to the board and I said, thing's getting unwieldy here. It's getting big. I need help. Go find someone. So I found someone who could complement me to help run the business. Very analytical. And we would have this kind of running, friendly argument. I said, Keith was the president, I'm the chairman and CEO. I said, Keith, what about luck in business? He goes, no. Yeah. There's no, you don't even worry about luck. It's rigorous analysis, intelligent decision making, and hard work. I said, of course. But what about luck? Nope. MTV Unplugged. Ever hear of MTV Unplugged? Yeah. So we're making 3,000 guitars a year. Now we picked up our game. The dealers are saying these are some of the finest Martin guitars we've seen in a long time, but we don't need many of them because there's no demand. Okay, that's our lot in life. And Dick Boak, who just retired, comes into my office and he goes, Chris, what? I had a funny call today. Oh, okay. From who? MTV. It was pre-Unplugged. I go, MTV, the rock video station. Yeah. Why'd they call you? Well, they have this funny idea. They want to create a new show. Okay, about what? They want to take rockers. Well, of course, it's MTV. And they want to put them in a studio. Okay, so it's not going to be a music video. No, they put them in a studio. And they want them to have play their famous rock songs. Okay. On acoustic guitars. Really? That's kind of clever. Why did they call us? Well, they want to film some of the shows in New York. They're filming live. Okay. And they're not sure that if they bring in the rockers from LA or San Francisco, or in the case of Kurt Cobain, Seattle or Great Britain, they may not have acoustic guitars or they may not want to travel with them. Could they borrow a couple of guitars? I said, why not? So he would, on a Monday morning, he would drive to Manhattan, MTV, drop them off. Saturday night, you'd turn on, it was live. You'd turn it on, sure enough, there was your famous rock star band playing their famous songs on Martin guitars. And the phone started to ring. So my argument with Keith was about luck. You cannot plan for luck. But if luck walks by you, pay attention. And in many respects, other than a couple of economic blips, like the Great Recession, business has been very good ever since. Because there's something really cool about the acoustic guitar. And periodically, people just have to be reminded of that. And the way, I can think of no better way to remind you of that than to ask Craig to come back up and play some music. And I'll be back.